My dear Collins, partly in the grim despair and restlessness of this subsidence from excitement, the performance of the Frozen Deep, and partly for the sake of household words, I want to cast about you whether you and I can go anywhere, take any tour, see anything, whereon we could write something together. Have you any idea, tending to any place in the world? Will you rattle your head and see if there's any pebble in it which we could wander away and play at marbles with? We want something for household words, and I want to escape from myself. For when I do start up and stare myself seedily in the face, this happens to be my case at present, my blankness is inconceivable, indescribable. My misery amazing. I shall be in town on Monday. Shall we talk then? Shall we talk at Gad's Hill? What shall we do? As I close this, I'm on my way back by train. Ever faithfully, Charles Dickens.
Welcome back to this bonus episode of Inimitable, the podcast by the Charles Dickens Museum. I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas season and that you've been kind of not too depressed this January. January is always a bit of a bleak month, isn't it, when you kind of lose your sparkly lights and lose your Christmas. We are here to talk about our current exhibition, Mutual Friends, The Adventures of Charles Dickens and Wilkie Collins. And to talk about this incredible exhibition, I've been joined by the museum curator, Emma Harper. You'll all recognise her from season 1 of the podcast, where she was one of our outstanding contributors. So, Emma, welcome back. You've been brave enough to return to the pod. I hope you're happy to be here.
Thank you very much. Yeah, very happy to be talking about Charles and Wilkie.
Fantastic. Well, let's just jump straight in then. I guess the first question, Wilkie Collins perhaps isn't quite as famous as Charles Dickens. So could you give us just, who is he, basically? Tell us a little bit about him.
Sure. So Wilkie Collins was a Victorian writer, just like Charles Dickens, and he's best known or best remembered perhaps for his invention of detective fiction as we know it today with his novel The Moonstone, and also for sensation novels, so really sort of ramping up the tension in his writing with novels like The Woman in White, and they're his two big masterpieces. But not many people know that he also was friends with Charles Dickens and that they collaborated a lot on various different types of work.
Really interesting. So how did they meet then? Did they meet through literary circles or...?
Yeah, a little bit through their mutual friends, hence the title, a nice little pun. They actually met as actors. They were both very keen on amateur dramatics, and they were invited by Augustus Egg, who knew both of them separately, to take part in an amateur production of Not So Bad As We Seem by Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton. And so they met whilst doing this production on the 12th of March, 1851, at John Forster's house, who was a great friend of Dickens. He became his biographer later on. So sort of all these different connections within the circles at the time. So Dickens played the Lord, obviously, and Wilkie played his butler or valet, which is quite typical of their early performances together. Charles tended to bag the best parts, but they then went on to be not just performers, but writers and collaborators.
Brilliant. I know that's such a funny kind of analogy almost, Dickens the Lord and Wilkie the Butler. And tell us a bit about where they are in their lives. So this is the early 1850s when they meet.
Yeah.
Where is Dickens in his life and where is Wilkie Collins, and how do they what's the dynamic of their friendship at that point?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of an age gap between the two. So Charles was born in 1812 and Wilkie was born in 1824. That's why we've sort of chosen to do the exhibition at this point, because it's the bicentenary of his birth. So Charles is very much an established writer by this point. He's had lots of successful novels. He's been on his first tour of America, where he's been sort of bombarded by the public and is really a celebrity. Wilkie's life is a little bit quieter. He's sort of trying his hand at various different things. And it is really, he's very skilled, but it's really meeting Charles that gives him his big break, because he starts contributing articles to Charles's journal, Household Words, which has a far greater readership than Wilkie would have been able to get at that point in his career elsewhere.
Okay, so that really helps his career take off. And so they become friends then. They obviously act together, they get on well, and they clearly like each other. Do we know what they got up to together?
Absolutely. And it's all the sort of things that we would do with our friends today. So they go for walks together. They love going out for dinner and drinks, whether that's at a favourite restaurant like Dickens's favourite restaurant, Ferry's, or if it's at each other's houses. They celebrate their birthdays together and they go on holidays together, as well as obviously writing together. And the writing is sort of interweaved throughout all those activities. Sometimes it's the cause of the activity and sometimes it's just a nice side effect.
Oh, lovely. And I love to think of them going on holiday together. You know, you don't really think of Victorians going on holidays in the same way that we do. But where did they go? What did they get up to?
Absolutely. So they were both quite fortunate in that by this point in their lives, they were comfortably well off. They could afford to go on holiday, and that was both within the UK and abroad. So they went on a famous trip to Italy with Augusta's eggs, so the friend that had introduced them. And they have this moustache growing competition while they're out there. It's a little bit of a sort of lad's holiday. And it's quite funny in Charles's letters home to his family. He writes about this, but he also writes about how his friends act and behave. You know, travelling with your friends can sort of make or break a relationship, I find. And he's sort of aghast that Wilkie turns up in the theatre in his scruffy clothes and moans about how much he goes on about the last time he was in Italy with his father as a young boy, seeing all the famous artworks. But then he says, but we get on tolerably well.
That's a high praise, tolerably well.
Absolutely.
Mind you, I think, wasn't there some irritation in terms of habits that Charles had?
Yes, so he said that everyone kind of spitted and snorted and none so much as Wilkie, and couldn't abide this.
I love that. That really is, you go on holiday with your land friends and suddenly you just see all those horrid kind of bodily habits that come to the fore. So, and they go off then, they go to France, I believe, or Italy?
France, Italy, places in Cumberland in the UK and places like that. All over.
Does that shape their work? Are they writing about these travels?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes the travels in themselves are to get inspiration for the writing. So the trip to Cumberland was expressly to come up with a story for Household Words for Charles's journal. And they decide to climb a mountain, basically. And it seems quite kind of unplanned and, they've not really thought it through. They find an innkeeper who can be their guide, but he's not been up for many, many years and, it's awful weather. Wilkie then sprains his ankle and sort of tumbles down the mountain a little bit. The compass breaks, so they don't really know where they are. And Wilkie has to be helped back down the mountain. And we know all this from Charles's letters back to his sister-in-law, Georgina. And that then becomes pretty much the first chapter of their collaboration, The Lazy Tour of Two Idle Apprentices. If you compare the phrases that Charles is using in his letter to Georgina and how it appears in the final text, it's exactly the same story. So he is just, regurgitating this story.
What actually happened. And in fact, we do have a wonderful extract read out by Simon Callow and Mark Gattis. So have a listen to this.
The trees dripped. The eaves of the scattered cottages dripped. The barren stone walls dividing the land dripped. The yelping dogs dripped. Carts and wagons under ill-roofed penthouses dripped. Melancholy cocks and hens perching on their shafts or seeking shelter underneath them dripped. Mr. Goodchild dripped. Thomas Idle dripped. The innkeeper dripped. The mare dripped. The vast curtains of mist and cloud passed before the shadowy forms of the hills, streamed water as they were drawn across the landscape. Down such steep pitches that the mare seemed to be trotting on her head, and up such steep pitches that she seemed to have a supplementary leg in her tail. The dog cart jolted and tilted back to the village. It was too wet for the women to look out. It was too wet even for the children to look out. All the doors and windows were closed, and the only sign of life or motion was in the rain-punctured puddles.
Whiskey and oil to Thomas Idle's ankle, and whiskey without oil to Francis Goodchild's stomach produced an agreeable change in the systems of both, soothing Mr. Idle's pain, which was sharp before, and sweetening Mr. Goodchild's temper, which was sweet before. Portmanteaus being then opened and clothes exchanged, Mr. Goodchild, through having no change of outer garments but broadcloth and velvet, suddenly became a magnificent portent in the innkeeper's house, a shining frontispiece to the fashions for the month, and a frightful anomaly in the Cumberland village.
Isn't that wonderful? It really, and like you say, it really does kind of evoke a sense of adventure that they must have shared in real life, as you say, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it reflects their personality. You know, the two lazy people in the two idle apprentices are based on Charles and Wilkie. So Charles is represented in Mr. Goodchild, and he is very industrious in his laziness. He really works at it and says, "Oh, I must be lazy today." And that's very much like Dickens. You know, and whatever he does, he throws himself into it, even if it's doing nothing. Whereas Wilkie, as represented by Mr. Idle, is the truly idle. He's just so laid back, just go with the flow. And I think that probably is what attracted Charles to Wilkie a little bit, but also could frustrate him. And again, I think that's represented in the way the story unfolds. So it's quite joking in a way, their collaboration.
There is actually another extract from the Lazy Tour which captures this differences in their idleness. So have a little listen to this extract, again by Simon Callow and Mark Gatiss.
Thomas, on his back, reading, listened with great composure and asked him whether he really had gone up those hills and bothered himself with those views and walked all those miles. Because I want to know, added Thomas, what you would say of it if you were obliged to do it.
It would be different then, said Francis. It would be work then. Now it's play.
Play, replied Thomas Idle, utterly repudiating the reply. Play? Here is a man goes systematically tearing himself to pieces and putting himself through an incessant course of training, as if he were always under articles to fight a match for the champion's belt, and he calls it play. Play? Exclaimed Thomas Idle, scornfully contemplating his one boot in the air. You can't play. You don't know what it is. You make work of everything.
The bright Goodchild amiably smiled.
So you do, said Thomas. I mean it. To me, you're an absolutely terrible fellow. You do nothing like another man. Where another fellow would fall into a footbath of action or emotion, you fall into a mine. Where another fellow would be a painted butterfly, you are a fiery dragon. Where another man would stake a sixpence, you stake your existence. If you were to go up in a balloon, you would make for heaven. And if you were to dive into the depths of the earth, nothing short of the other place would content you. What a fellow you are, Francis.
The cheerful Goodchild laughed.
All very well to laugh, but I wonder you don't feel it to be serious, said Idle. A man who can do nothing by halves appears to me to be a fearful man.
Tom, returned Goodchild, if I can do nothing by halves, and be nothing by halves, it's pretty clear that you must take me as a whole, and make the best of me. With this philosophical rejoinder, the airy Goodchild clapped Mr. Idle on the shoulder in a final manner, and they sat down to dinner.
Obviously, then, this Lazy Tour of Two Idle Apprentices is a work that's been co-written by Dickens and Collins. Is it normal for Victorian writers to write a story together in that way?
Sort of yes and no. There was a lot of collaboration and a lot of sort of sharing of ideas. But for Dickens, Wilkie Collins was the person he ended up collaborating with most. And it really went on a journey. So their first collaboration was very much more, they will both write separate sections and then put it together. So sort of having a practice at writing something together. Then slowly it became more collaborative, like on Lazy Tour. That first one was the Wreck of the Golden Mary. So the first section is written from the viewpoint of one character, and that's Charles writing, and then it switches to another character, and that's Wilkie writing. So we can be quite clear about who's written what section. Lazy Tour is a little bit more collaborative. They've worked out the story together. They sort of know where they're going. Again, I feel that you can tell which bits are written by them individually, but there is some collaboration. You've got other elements such as the plays, so The Frozen Deep and The Lighthouse. The Lighthouse was written by Wilkie and then was produced by Charles in his theatre. So that's a different form of collaboration. And then The Frozen Deep, they worked on the story together. So they'd mapped it all out. It was based on an 1845 trip to find the Northwest Passage by these Arctic explorers. And so they knew the plot of it. Wilkie went away and wrote it, and then Dickens edited it, and then there was some back and forth. So there were lots of different ways that they collaborated through their stories.
That's really interesting. And again, it's just this idea of like, you know, shared creativity. It's really lovely to think about that, isn't it? And of course, they're both actors. So as you say, things like The Frozen Deep, you've got kind of the book version and a play version, don't you?
Absolutely. And it was reworked many different times as well, in different ways by both of them. But yes, and again, they both performed in The Frozen Deep. Another reason The Frozen Deep is very important in their relationship is it's where they meet the Ternan family. This is a family of actors. The mother was an actor and her daughters followed her onto the stage. And The Frozen Deep was originally performed in London, and it was Charles Dickens's daughters who performed the roles. But when it started going to Manchester and further abroad, it was felt, oh, that wasn't quite right for Dickens's daughters to be performing. So they employed these professional actors, the Ternans. And one of them was Ellen Ternan, who Dickens later goes on to have a relationship with. And as soon as he meets Ellen, he's absolutely obsessed with her. And we see this in his letters to Wilkie. He says, "I've not had a moment's peace since the night of The Frozen Deep." And Wilkie is pretty much the only person that we can tell that he talks to about Ellen. And in fact, the trip up to Cumberland, that ends with them leaving, and Dickens goes on to Doncaster to the races, and we know that he meets Ellen there. Whereas in letters back home, he said, "Oh, we're not sure where we're going next."
Wow.
But Wilkie knows because he's with him.
Yeah, and that's a really fascinating part of their friendship because, of course, you know, the whole relationship with Ellington was a closely guarded secret.
Absolutely.
Very few people knew about it. But
So it
clearly,
shows how close they were, that they confided in each other in this way.
absolutely. And there is more evidence. I mean, one of the things that I was really struck with in the exhibition is that there is that very, I don't know what the word is, human aspect of their relationship, isn't
Yeah.
it? They're quite free in their kind of conversations about their relationships and their sex lives,
Absolutely.
basically. aren't
Yeah, and I was really keen to show that element in the exhibition because I think we can think of them as these two great giants of literature, which obviously they are, and they had a huge impact on literature down the years. But they were also just two men and sort of navigating the challenges of adult life and friendship. So I really wanted to bring that personable side to life and make them more relatable, I guess.
Because they do discuss treatments, don't they, for what we would now call STIs.
Yeah,
essentially.
absolutely. So it's sort of a coded reference, but Dickens writes, or I hope, I can't remember quite the phrasing, I hope you won't long be out in the Hunterian Ocean. And that's a reference to John Hunter, who discovered a sort of treatment for gonorrhea. So effectively saying that Wilkie has this sexually transmitted disease. So yeah, they were clearly talking about all sorts.
And of course, Wilkie himself has quite a shall we say, unusual private life, doesn't he?
Yeah, Wilkie doesn't believe in marriage, essentially, and that comes through, I think, in his work as well. Not that he doesn't believe in it, but he feels that it is very much a construct. So he lives with a lady called Caroline Graves for about 10 years. They're not married, but they present themselves very much as a couple. She eventually gives him an ultimatum saying, "Oh, you know, marry me or I'm going to go off and marry someone else." Wilkie typically just sort of dithers around and is a bit uncommittal, and so Caroline understandably gets fed up and she does leave and she marries Joseph Clow. But within a couple of years, we can tell by censuses and things like that, that she is back in Wilkie's household. And she's now listed as housekeeper. I think previously she has been referred to as spouse, but she's now listed as housekeeper. That wasn't that unusual for the time, and that may just have been her role. They may not have resumed a relationship, but obviously that wasn't too traditional. In the intervening years, and probably timeline's a little bit sketchy, but probably just before Caroline went off and married Joseph, Wilkie also met and started a relationship with Martha Rudd, who was a much younger woman from Norfolk. And he sets her up in a different household in London and goes on to have a child with her. Should be said, Wilkie's besotted with Caroline's children from a previous marriage as well, and very much adopts them as his own, but then goes on to have this child with Martha Rudd. But they don't ever live together. So Wilkie and Caroline are in one household, Martha and the children are in another. Wilkie very much supports them, goes and visits them, but it's not a traditional family household. And he does explore, as I say, a lot of these themes within his novels as well, and the effect marriage has on women. So I think Wilkie was quite a feminist, really, in terms of he would support children staying with the mother in the breakup of marriage, which we know was not typical Dickens when he broke with Catherine. All but the eldest child stayed with Charles. So yeah, a few different themes coming through there.
Really fascinating. And again, I think that's one of the wonderful things about the exhibition is I think we have an illusion in our head of what the Victorian world was like, and you kind of think of it as being a very sort of set way where everyone has a very strong attachment to the nuclear family, and actually there's clearly examples where that just isn't the
it's
case.
Just a bit more fluid. What is interesting though is that we do have a letter on display in the exhibition, which again is Charles writing back to his sister-in-law Georgina, and he uses this phrase, Wilkie's affairs defy all prediction, and it's specifically writing about his situation with Caroline. Unclear whether he knows about Martha as well at this point, but he probably does. And I just sort of think it's a bit rich coming from Charles, given that he's been having this affair with Ellen before he separated from Catherine as well as after, but that he clearly does have this sense of family that maybe he feels Wilkie isn't abiding by traditional morals that his other friends maybe would understand a bit more, but Wilkie's younger and freer, and that sort of generational gap.
And it's interesting because that then there seems to be a kind of an element of difference approaching into the friendship at this point. And do we know that things start to go wrong in the friendship between the two men?
Again, it's sort of a yes and no. So we have this section in the exhibition called Contention, where we just look at a few different points that we think might be a little bit awkward in the relationship and might cause some upset. One of the main issues we have is that Charles Dickens burned a huge number of his letters in a quite famous now fire at Gad's Hill. He was worried about how he would be seen, his legacy after he died. This was quite a common Victorian anxiety about what letters said about you after your death. And in fact, Wilkie includes burning of letters in a couple of his plots as well, so we don't know whether Charles got the idea from there or certainly was supported from that. So we don't have the whole picture because we don't have lots of evidence. But as I say, we do have this letter where he says Wilkie's affairs defy all prediction. We have their relationship as both as mentor and mentee, but also as employer and employee. So Charles is essentially Wilkie's boss at Household Words. He's the editor, it's his face on the cover. No one else normally is credited with their authorship. Wilkie is actually the only person who does eventually get his name against some of his work. He's paid slightly less than Dickens. That could be a point of contention. And what I find most interesting is that we have letters between Charles and the other editor, Wills, where Charles is saying, keep an eye on Wilkie's writing. I don't want it to upset my middle-class readership. Again, Wilkie was a little bit more forthright in his political views, and Charles was aware of what his public would think about some of those views and was trying to shield. He writes to Wilkie that he's toned down his article on public opinion, I think it's called. He says, you won't find it noticeably changed. But there are sort of these two sides. It's his editor talking to Wills going, we've got to keep an eye on this, and then keeping Wilkie sweet because they are friends and he doesn't want to disrupt that friendship. Having said that, Wilkie does very well from Household Words. Woman in White made more through that than Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities.
Really?
You might then have a little bit of jealousy coming into
Yeah.
the friendship there as well. And eventually he does leave, and there doesn't seem to be any acrimony. Charles writes to him and says, remember, me and Wills will have you back at any point with open arms. I'm sad that this part of our relationship is coming to an end, but he knows that they'll still be friends. Later on, there has been this suggestion that there was a big argument between the two. After about 1867, 1868, there's not as many letters. They don't collaborate anymore. I don't see it quite in that way. As I say, there are these points of contention, but I don't see it as a big bust up. The final letter that we have from Charles to Wilkie that survives, it starts quite formally because he's responding to a business request from Wilkie saying, yes, I say that this is your copyright, and it formalises that. But he then says, perhaps I will see you by and by. I don't want to bother you, but maybe I'll see you soon. Who knows? And it's quite poignant the way he says it. And I think even if there has been a little bit of an argument, Charles misses him. That's what I get from it. He knows that Wilkie's been unwell, and he asks very sincerely about his health in the letter. So there clearly has been a drifting apart, shall we say, but I think that's as much to do with circumstance. Charles is in America doing his final reading tour, what would be his final reading tour there. Wilkie's moved on to other things. He maybe doesn't need Charles quite as much in the collaboration. So I see it more as a busy men, busy doing other things. Their lives have drifted apart a little bit on the professional front, and maybe they just haven't found enough time for the friendship in recent years.
And it's quite sad, isn't it? Because that note sort of saying, I didn't want to bother you, that is something the friendship's lost, isn't it? He feels that he would be intruding if he went to see him in a way that actually, a couple of years before wouldn't have been at all. Yeah, so it is sad to think that the friendship may have been lost. But Charles and Wilkie are also connected by family, though, aren't they? And how did that impact their relationship?
They are, yeah. So Charles's daughter, Katie, marries Wilkie's brother, also confusingly called Charles Collins, who was in his own right an artist, a writer, a very creative man, as Wilkie and Charles were as well. The relationship between the two Charleses, again, seems not always to have been a happy one. I think Charles Dickens had some regrets that he sort of knows Katie only married Charles Collins because she was unhappy with the separation of their own marriage and was looking to escape the family home, essentially, and this is the first opportunity that came along. Having said that, the two Charleses also worked together. So Charles Collins designed the front cover and illustrations for Charles Dickens's last unfinished work, The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Unfortunately, Charles Collins also had to stop that before he had completed it due to his illness. So they were all connected by family, which I think anyone who has family will know sometimes helps and sometimes doesn't. Yeah.
And of course, there's all sorts of questions raised. I know there's an article written by Lucinda Hawksley recently on Charles Collins, and of course the marriage between him and Katie wasn't a particularly good one. They think the marriage was probably unconsummated. He could well have been gay, and people quite possibly knew about it. So I suppose that could again have added friction between...
I think it was probably a source of tension, and there are a couple of references in Dickens's letter where he seems to be aware of this as well. And Katie very soon marries again later.
Yeah, but of course, as you say, it's that complications of the friendship. So it's really fascinating to think of. And of course, we only get scraps of it, don't we? So it's hard to know.
Absolutely. And we've not really got any direct correspondence between Charles and Wilkie, well, at all really, but not specifically that mentions the brother.
So we suppose then they've had, almost 20 years of close friendship, from the early 1850s. Dickens, of course, dies in 1870. Do we know much about Wilkie's reaction to Dickens's death?
Yeah, absolutely. So Wilkie is one of the few people at Dickens's funeral. There are only 12 or 13. We're not certain again whether Ellen was at the funeral or not, but only basically a dozen people at the graveside. Dickens himself did not want a big pomp and circumstance, as he calls it. However, after he died, there were calls from the public and from the church in particular that he should be buried in Westminster Abbey, which is what happens, and Wilkie goes to the funeral. And this has been another suggestion for a sort of a bust-up in the relationship, is that Wilkie writes to his editor the day after saying, Dickens's funeral was a lost day to me. And some people have taken that to mean, oh, he didn't want to go. They'd argued. Now, I sort of think, of course, one of your best friend's funerals is going to be a lost day to you, because you can't possibly be thinking about anything else. He can't get on with his work. It was Charles who had taught him the value of a good day's work and how important that was to do it regularly. Charles Dickens himself, the only time he sort of missed a deadline for work was when he was grieving for his sister-in-law, Mary Hogarth. So there's sort of the precedent there. And I think when you're grieving, it's very hard to tell the tone from a letter to begin with, but when you're grieving, things maybe come out in a slightly different way to how you had intended. But ultimately, I think, he was at the funeral. He was important enough to be there. The family wanted him to be there. And in fact, some of Dickens's other closest friends, the Beards, were not there. And we've got letters from Georgina saying, only the family could be there. And that's sort of a white lie, because, of course, Wilkie wasn't technically family. And he was there. Afterwards, he does keep in touch with some of Dickens's friends as well, the Forsters. And there's a little bit of an interesting side story on that. And so a couple of years after Dickens died, John Forster produces a biography of Dickens's life. And this includes quite a big revelation that when Charles Dickens was a child, he went to work in a blacking factory, putting labels on bottles of polish. This was not known to his friends and family, as far as we know. It seems like he hadn't told Wilkie. We've got an account that Charles tells Wilkie about his life, and indeed he says, this is the first time I've set down my particulars and I feel like a caged lion, walking up and down. But he didn't tell Wilkie about this element of his life, but he clearly had told John Forster. And there was a little bit of jealousy between of Forster of Wilkie and Charles, and Wilkie of Forster and Dickens. And there's a copy of Forster's biography that we believe was Wilkie Collins that's got some annotations in the margins where he's sort of commenting on Dickens's work, and it's not always that complimentary, shall we say. And we're trying to track down the whereabouts of this book. It was sold at auction in 1890, and that's how we know about these annotations, as they were transcribed in the auction. And we've traced it sort of down various wills to a particular family, but it may well have been thrown out or just gone into the ether. But that again sort of puts their friendship into question a little bit. I sort of have this image that Wilkie probably just got a little bit drunk one night and started writing in the book and venting out of sort of grief and jealousy, but that's just my
To be honest, I think
story.
that's a perfectly reasonable conclusion, actually. I think one of the lines, isn't it, is when he's writing about the mystery of Edwin Drood, and he writes, it's the melancholy work of a worn-out mind, and you think wonderfully bitchy.
Yeah. Having said that, Charles could be quite bitchy about Wilkie's works in his lifetime, in letters to other people, but I don't think they would particularly have held back to each other.
Yeah.
They were supportive, but if Wilkie made a suggestion about Charles's work, as he did with I think A Tale of Two Cities, Charles writes back, you ask if it could be done in this way? No, I don't think it could have been. Whereas Charles, when he suggests things to Wilkie, he sort of expects his suggestions to be taken up, and is much more sort of like, you give the audience too much credit here, or you don't leave enough to the audience's imagination, you don't trust them enough, all of this. So it's quite interesting, the back and forth that they had.
Absolutely. Well, Emma, thank you so much. It is a really wonderful exhibition, and it really does look at all these key themes of friendship. And I think what's lovely about it is, we're reading about these two historical figures, but in many ways you're reading about the friendship of two people, and it really covers all of those human dimensions of the joy and the productive, the creativity, productivity that they shared together, but also the jealousies and the rivalries and the things that kind of frustrate all relationships, really.
Absolutely.
So it's a really wonderful insight. How long does the exhibition run until?
So it runs until the 21st of April, so you've still got some time to catch it, and we're open Wednesdays to Sundays, so come along and see it.
Please do come and see it. Emma, thank you very much, and thank you guys for listening.